She vanished as a child in 2000, lost to a frozen lake and forgotten by time. But in 2025, a drone's chilling discovery beneath the ice shattered decades of silence. What the camera captured beneath the surface will haunt you forever. You won't want to miss this story. But before we dive in, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a video like this one. I still remember the way the snow looked that morning, like sifted flour across the clearing behind the cabin, untouched and quiet in a way that made the whole forest feel like it was holding its breath. My name is Noah Granger, and I was 12 when my little sister Elise vanished from the world. We were just kids then, staying at that old pinewood cabin our grandfather built in the 70s, bundled in parkas and snow boots, laughing about nothing, slurping cocoa by the fire like we had no idea time could stop. Elise was 10, fearless and curious in that gentle way where everything felt like an adventure. She loved snow more than anyone I knew, always trying to shape it into castles and animals, telling stories while she packed snowballs or scraped ice from the porch rail with a spoon. That morning, the 23rd of December, she was out back with our cousins building a snow fort near the edge of Silver Pine Lake. It wasn't far from the cabin, just past the big pine with the twisted trunk and the old bird feeder that never had seed. I remember my mom yelling for lunch and everyone stomping inside, red-cheeked and giggling, shedding gloves and scarves in piles. But Elise didn't come back in. At first, we thought she was just finishing the fort, maybe stubborn about some snow tunnel she had started. My uncle went out to call her. Then I did. The wind picked up around then, just enough to sting the eyes and make your breath show sharp. We found the fort half built, and her hat lying beside it like it had fallen, and no one thought to pick it up. The snow showed her tracks going toward the lake, just a few prints, clear and spaced like she was walking, not running. But they stopped. That was the part that made my stomach go hollow. Just stopped. No drag marks, no split in the snow, no footprints coming back. It was like she stepped into nothing. My dad shouted her name, over and over, his voice cracking more each time. Search crews came. Dogs, helicopters, divers. They cut a hole in the lake ice but found nothing. They said the ice was too thick for her to have fallen through. They said maybe a wild animal took her, though no blood or signs of struggle ever showed. They said a lot of things, but none of them made sense. None of them explained why I still wake up some nights sure I heard her whisper my name. The silence after that day wasn't just outside. It lived in us. My mom stopped playing music. My dad stopped smiling. And I stopped walking near frozen water. We left the cabin for good that spring. My parents sold it quietly. But I never let it go. Not really. Because part of me always knew the lake hadn't taken her. Something else had. Something that waited in silence. After Elise disappeared, the lake stopped being a place of family memories and became something else entirely, a wound we all tiptoed around. The cabin was locked up by March, and our parents barely spoke on the drive home, like words had become too fragile to risk breaking. Over the years, I tried to convince myself that time would blur the edges of that day, but it never did. Not really. It just sharpened them in quiet ways every winter, every snowfall, every laugh from a little girl in a store aisle that sounded just close enough to hers to stop my heart for a second. I grew up carrying her ghost like an invisible sibling, always wondering if she'd be 13 now, or 16, or 23. My parents split not long after. My dad moved to Florida, said he couldn't take the winters anymore. My mom kept the same house, but her eyes never fully returned from that lakeshore. I buried myself in books and then in cameras, photography becoming the only way I could make sense of a world where someone could vanish without leaving even a broken branch behind. I never forgot Elise. Never let myself. Every year, on the 23rd of December, I'd visit the lake, not the cabin, that was sold off and shuttered, but the public access point, half a mile east. I'd sit on the rocks and watch the water freeze over in sheets, my breath thick in the cold, imagining her face under the surface like some fairy tale no one wanted to tell. In 2025, I was working freelance for a documentary crew, mostly shooting forgotten towns and derelict buildings for a paranormal series. It paid poorly, but it kept me moving, kept my hands too busy to shake. One day in January, our director sent out a list of haunted locations to consider for the winter segment. Silver Pine Lake was on it. My heart stalled. I stared at the screen for nearly an hour before replying. I said yes. I said I'd scout it solo. I didn't tell them why. I didn't tell anyone. The lake hadn't been mentioned in the news in over a decade, but something about it still prickled at the edge of local lore. The little girl who vanished, the frozen silence, the footprints that just stopped. When I arrived at the lake that morning, the air had that same old, breathless cold, the kind that makes you feel like the world is holding back a secret. I set up my drone gear near the edge of the trees, the same trees I used to run past as a boy. As the propellers spun up and the drone lifted into that still, aching sky, I had no idea that something beneath the ice had been waiting, not just for discovery, but for return. The drone hovered steady above the lake, its hum barely audible against the hush of pine and snow, and I watched the monitor like it might give me back something I didn't dare say aloud. The surface was glassy, a mirror to the white sky, but fractured in places with hairline cracks that spiderwebbed outward like veins. I guided the drone slowly over the water, past the old dock that had half collapsed under weight and weather, its wooden boards now warped like a forgotten spine. And then something blinked on the thermal feed, a faint irregularity near the center of the lake. At first, I assumed it was an animal beneath the ice, maybe a fish or thermal anomaly. But as I adjusted the contrast, a shape began to form. Not a blur, not static. A figure, small, human-sized. Lying still beneath the surface, arms slightly raised, as if reaching. My breath caught. The temperature dropped in the space around me. Not in reality, but in my ribs. I marked the coordinates and brought the drone lower, just above the lake's center, letting the camera zoom in. The shape was faint, distorted by ice and years, and maybe even hope, but it was there. No clothes distinguishable, no movement, just a pale silhouette frozen beneath layers of glassy time. I didn't speak, didn't blink, just stared until my eyes watered and my fingers went numb on the controls. I saved the footage twice, then again, backing it up like it was sacred text. My first thought was that I had finally found her Elise, or the memory of her, or maybe just the idea of her that had followed me for 25 winters. But another part of me knew better. This didn't feel like closure. It felt like something was opening. I packed up slowly, numb all over, and drove straight to the ranger station in town. I told them I was flying a drone legally, scouting terrain for a film crew, and had picked up something unusual. I didn't say who I thought it was. I didn't say her name. They called in a state forensic team within hours. By the next day, the site was cordoned off, the lake cleared of curious locals, and divers brought in despite the ice. But when they cut through the exact patch I'd marked, they found nothing. No body, no fabric, just air bubbles sealed in crystal water. And yet, when they reviewed my footage, the shape was still there, clear as day, frame by frame, but somehow not present anymore in the physical world. I stood behind the investigator's chair, as he played it again, slowly, until the shape dissolved. Not faded, dissolved. Like it had been watching, then chose to disappear. "This isn't possible," someone muttered. I didn't answer, because I had seen her, Elise, or her echo, or her warning. And somehow, that was worse than finding nothing at all. I was just supposed to be cataloging ice data. Another long day spent watching temperature readouts blink across the screen like tiny heartbeats. Part of an initiative nobody outside the department cared about, unless it affected fishing or tourism. We were scanning Silver Pine for ice regression 14 inches left this late in winter, which already said more than it should have, when something lit up on the subsurface feed that didn't make sense. At first I figured it was a trapped log or maybe an old snowmobile that had gone under decades ago, the kind of thing locals shrug off as legend. But this was different. Too symmetrical. Too still. The sonar pinged it once, then again, showing the outline of what looked unmistakably like a person curled on their side, knees slightly bent, one hand raised toward the surface like they'd been trying to wave through time. The footage looped in silence as I stared. I hadn't been part of the original search for Elise Granger. I hadn't even heard her name, until the technician sitting beside me mumbled it under his breath, like saying it too loud might crack the air. "Could it be her?" he whispered, and suddenly the room felt colder than the ice we were mapping. We cross-referenced the coordinates with old police reports, and the match was exact right down to the broken dock nearby, the one still barely standing after all these years. It was a detail no one had paid much attention to, a relic of grief weathered into the scenery. But now, it pulsed on the map, like a scar. I tried to think rationally, to tell myself bodies don't stay preserved like that under lake ice for 25 years, without some sign, some shifting or surfacing, but the footage said otherwise. And not just the shape. There was color. The outline of something pink near what might have been a wrist. We pulled up archived photos from 2000, grainy and faded, and there it was, Elise in a puffy pink scarf with a heart stitched near the edge, a Christmas gift from her grandmother. I stared at the frozen silhouette until my eyes burned, until the screen blurred, and still I kept watching, like I might catch her blinking or moving or whispering from beneath the ice. The next day, a recovery team came with drills and gear. But by the time they reached the spot, the shape was gone. The ice was untouched. Not even a pressure crack. It was as if she had never been there at all. Except we had the footage. Multiple angles. Time-stamped. Verified. And yet, no one could explain why she appeared for just those few hours and then vanished like fog under a rising Sunday. That night, I dreamed of the lake. I saw her under the surface, eyes wide open, not scared, just waiting, like she had always been there, like she had chosen that moment to finally be seen. The footage spread faster than wildfire, on dry brush, bouncing from academic circles to conspiracy forums to national news in less than 48 hours, and with it came the flood of voices, skeptics, psychics, ex-cops, and people who swore they remembered Elise from somewhere else entirely. They called it everything from a hoax to a haunting, and still I couldn't stop watching it, over and over. That brief shimmer of her hand through the ice, the soft blur of her scarf, the shadow that shifted just enough to suggest breath or thought or intention. Her parents, now living in Arizona and long divorced, were flown in for interviews. Her mother, Judith, trembled as she looked at the screen, lips parting like a wound, whispering, "That's her." I'd know that posture anywhere. Her father didn't say much, just stared with that shell-shocked glaze some people wear when grief is too old to be raw. but too deep to ever really heal. He walked out before the segment finished. Meanwhile, Silver Pine Lake was closed off by local authorities for public safety, though everyone knew it was more about curiosity than concern. Tourists showed up with cameras. People tossed stuffed animals into the water. Someone lit candles in a circle on the snowbank, and a child's voice echoed from a speaker in the trees, looping one of Elise's old home videos. I should have felt triumphant that our drone project was getting attention, but it didn't feel like discovery. It felt like intrusion, like we'd cracked open something meant to stay sealed. That weekend, I returned to the lake with my colleague Juno. She was quieter than usual, her hands shoved deep into her parka pockets, her breath visible in tight bursts, and we stood at the same coordinates, looking down at the same unbroken ice. Nothing there now, not even a ripple. But when I looked through the drone lens again, zooming in on the exact timestamp and angle, there it was still. A faint outline, not as clear, almost like it was fading, but present. The feed was live. That's what rattled me. This wasn't a saved clip or a glitch or a pre-recorded render. It was now. It was here. Elise was showing herself only to the lens, like the human eye couldn't hold her. Juno touched my arm then, her voice low. What if it's not her body? What if it's a memory the lake kept? That line stuck with me for days. Not ghost, not girl, just memory, looping like a dream unfinished. But then we found the hair, frozen in a shallow shelf near the shore. A long strand, fine and brown, embedded in the ice like it had waited all this time for proof. DNA confirmed it. Elise. But if that was her, if she really died there, then what did I see under the surface? And who, or what, was watching us back? The night after the DNA results came back, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing her hand, that blurry shape beneath the ice, and the thought that kept gnawing at the edge of my mind was this. How could a body stay preserved like that for 25 years? In water that freezes and thaws, expands and shifts with every changing season, I tried to tell myself it was just science, that some combination of temperature and pressure and luck had preserved the remains, but something about it felt wrong. Not because of the evidence, but because of the feeling it left behind. Like we hadn't found a body at all, but a boundary. Something Elise had been caught inside. I drove out to the lake again that morning, just before sunrise, before the world started making noise. The water was still frozen, the surface smooth as polished stone, and the cabin, that old weather-beaten skeleton, loomed at the edge of the pines, like it remembered everything but couldn't speak. I walked its perimeter slowly, crunching over snow and broken pine cones, and when I reached the back porch, I saw something that made my breath lock. Tiny footprints, fresh, leading from the woods to the cabin steps. Too small for an adult, too deep for an animal. Just there. No return trail, no explanation. I followed them without thinking, every part of me tightening, heart hammering like a warning bell. The back door was ajar, and inside the air felt colder than outside, like the cold had settled not just into the walls, but into time itself. Dust covered everything, but there were new smudges on the window glass, as if someone small had pressed their hands against it from the inside. I called out her name quietly, not really expecting an answer, but needing to break the silence. And that's when I heard it. A creak upstairs. A single, weightless footstep. I stood frozen for what felt like forever, staring up at the old staircase, knowing it was impossible, knowing no one else should be here. But I went up anyway. I had to. At the top of the stairs was a narrow hallway, and 3 doors. 2 were shut, one was cracked open, and inside it, I swear, I saw something vanish. Just as I looked, not a shape, but the suggestion of one. I stepped in, and the air turned sharp, metallic, like breathing in the smell of pennies. On the wall was a drawing in crayon, a stick figure with long brown hair standing next to a cabin, and under it the name Elise. I took a photo and backed out slowly, the way you back away from a cliff edge you didn't realize you were standing on. I didn't sleep that night either, or the one after. Because if Elise was gone, why did it feel like she was still trying to come home? 2 days after finding the crayon drawing, I went back to the cabin with a friend from college, Drew, who now worked in digital forensics and owed me a favor. I didn't tell him everything, not about the footprints, or the noise upstairs, or the weight in the air that felt like memory trying to claw its way back through the floorboards. I just told him I needed a thermal sweep, and someone to verify I hadn't lost my mind. He brought a heat camera and a ground scanner, the kind used for structural shifts, and we worked in silence, the same way people walk through graveyards. At first, nothing. The place was cold, dead, like it had given up all its secrets to time. But then Drew paused at the upstairs landing, squinting at the screen. There was a faint residual signature in the center of the back room, not recent, but not old either. "You said no one's lived here in decades, right?" he asked, tapping the screen. "Then this makes no sense." We followed the anomaly to the far wall, where the scanner detected a hollow space behind the wood paneling. Drew thought it might be just a collapsed vent, but I knew better. I peeled back the warped boards with my bare hands, splinters biting into my palms, and behind them was a narrow crawl space lined with brittle insulation and silence. Inside, we found a box. An old tin lunchbox, rusted around the edges, the kind with cartoon dinosaurs on the side, Elise's favorite. My hands shook when I opened it. Inside were folded pieces of paper, yellowed and fragile, each with a short sentence written in blocky, uneven handwriting. "It's cold. I'm hungry. Why won't they come?" But the last one was different. Not sad, not scared. Just calm. "I'm not alone anymore." Drew looked at me like he didn't want to ask what that meant. I didn't tell him. I couldn't. We left the cabin before the sun dipped behind the pines, and for the first time in weeks, I locked the front door behind me. That night, I dreamt of her, not the girl she was, but something older, standing at the lake's edge with her hair plastered to her face and her mouth barely moving. In the dream, I asked her where she'd been. She didn't answer. She just turned and pointed at the ice. When I woke, I felt like someone had whispered my name against my ear, and the air in my bedroom was too still, like it was waiting for me to speak first. I didn't. I just sat up, pulled the covers to my chest, and listened for footsteps that never came. But I knew they would. I knew whatever we'd disturbed in that cabin wasn't finished. I didn't go back for 3 days, but the box stayed on my nightstand like it belonged there, like it had always been there, quietly leaking memory into the room. I'd open it, not to read the notes again, I knew them by heart now, but to hold something Elise had touched, something she left behind like a breadcrumb in the dark. I started researching missing children in the area, not just Elise, and the deeper I dug, the more the silence around her case made sense. She wasn't the only one. 3 other children had disappeared from towns within a 30-mile radius between 1999 and 2002. All were girls. All around her age. All in cold weather months. But unlike Elise, their stories had explanations, weak ones, but official. One was said to have drowned in a river, though no body was ever recovered. Another was likely taken by a non-custodial parent, even though no one saw a vehicle. The third, a girl named Natalie Hurst, was simply marked runaway, despite being 10 years old and found with no belongings missing. What haunted me most was a single detail buried in an old sheriff's report on Natalie's case. She was last seen drawing in the snow with a red crayon. I sat back in my chair when I read that, pulse thudding in my ears like something heavy knocking from the inside. I stared at the lunchbox, at Elise's crude drawing of the cabin and the lake, and I realized it wasn't just a picture. It was a map. I took a ruler, measured the proportions, followed the path sketched from the tree line to a small X in the lake. It didn't align with the dock or the usual swimming area. It was further out, past the reeds, nearly to the lake's deepest center, and chillingly close to where the drone had picked up the anomaly. That night, I barely slept. I heard soft footsteps above me, even though I live in a single-story home. I heard the crunch of snow outside, even though it hadn't snowed in weeks. I told myself it was just my imagination, that obsession was warping the shape of reality. But when I opened the front door at dawn, there were small prints in the frost-covered grass. Not boot prints. Not adult, just bare, child-sized feet, leading from the woods to my porch. They stopped 2 feet from my door, then vanished. No return trail, no smudging, just gone. I called Drew. I told him we had to go back to the lake not later, not next weekend, now. I didn't explain why. He didn't ask. Some things don't need explaining when the fear is real and the shadows are moving again. He just said, okay, bring the map, bring the drone, bring whatever you've got, and maybe, just maybe, we'll find out what that X really marks beneath the ice. We returned to Silver Pine Lake just after sunrise, the trees coated in a frost so thick, it looked like the whole forest had been dipped in powdered sugar, but nothing about it felt sweet. Drew parked the van near the edge of the old path, and we hiked the rest of the way on foot, following the map Elise had drawn, with that broken red crayon. I didn't speak much, just kept checking the alignment of the landmarks, the crooked pine, the small outcropping of rock shaped like a sleeping dog, and finally the spot she'd marked with an X. The lake was frozen solid, smooth and clear like glass, and beneath it shimmered something strange, like the suggestion of structure or shape pressed against the ice from below. Drew set up the drone, calibrating the sensors while I stood there, staring down into the lake like I expected a face to suddenly rise and press against it. The moment the drone dipped into the air and hovered over the marked spot, the screen flickered once, then again. The thermal scanner picked up a pocket of warmth, unnatural and round, about 12 feet below the surface, but it was what came next that froze me. Drew adjusted the drone's camera to visible spectrum and enhanced contrast. There, through the ice and snow, was the faint outline of what looked like a doorway, not carved, not natural. It had hinges, metal ones. Drew muttered something, but I wasn't listening. I was watching the way the snow above the outline started to swirl, like wind inside glass, though the air was completely still. A shadow passed beneath the drone, something that shouldn't have been there, and the camera momentarily blurred. When it refocused, the doorway was gone. Or rather, covered. A white film had spread across it in seconds, like frost reclaiming a secret. Drew looked at me. That wasn't on the previous scans. I nodded slowly, my breath curling in the air, like smoke. We pulled the drone back and took a moment to just listen. There were no birds, no wind, just the groan of thick winter silence. Then something knocked, a single sound from under the ice. Like knuckles against a coffin lid, Drew stepped back, his face pale. Tell me, that was the drone hitting something. But it wasn't. The drone was 2 feet above the surface, perfectly still. We stared at each other, and for a long time, neither of us moved. I wanted to believe it was just pressure, maybe an air bubble shifting below. But my gut and the ache in my chest that had never gone away told me something else. Something was down there, or someone, and they wanted us to know it. I turned toward the trees, toward the old cabin just barely visible through the branches, and said, "We're not done. Not yet." Then we packed up, marking the GPS coordinates. Whatever was beneath that ice, it had waited 25 years. It could wait one more night. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake in the cabin, the same one we had stayed in all those years ago, the walls creaking like they remembered too much and refused to forget. The mattress was different, the curtains replaced, but the air felt the same, thick with memory and something colder than the weather. I stared at the ceiling, listening for something, anything. Footsteps, whispers, the soft scrape of fingernails on wood. But there was only silence, broken occasionally by Drew shifting in the room down the hall and the distant groan of the lake ice settling. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, a knock. This time not from beneath the lake, but closer, sharper. I sat up, heart thudding, and crept to the living room window. Outside, the snow reflected the moonlight in soft blue hues, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing by the edge of the lake, small, still, barefoot. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't wake Drew. I just pulled on my boots, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and stepped out into the cold. The wind was still, the trees frozen in place like sentinels too afraid to move. I walked toward the lake, every crunch of snow under my boots echoing in my chest. When I reached the shoreline, I saw it again, an impression in the snow. Small footprints, not deep, but fresh. They led toward the center of the lake, and then stopped. I knelt, brushing away a patch of snow, and beneath it, the ice shimmered clear. My breath caught. There was a handprint on the inside of the ice. Tiny, pressed flat, like someone had reached up from below and touched it gently, as if to say, "I'm still here." My knees buckled, and I sat in the snow, staring at that handprint until the sun began to rise. When I returned to the cabin, Drew was already up, coffee in hand, eyes wide with questions he didn't need to ask. I showed him the photo I had taken. He stared at it, jaw clenched, then simply said, "It's her." And somehow, I knew he was right. We contacted the authorities that morning, but they responded the way they always do, with skepticism layered in concern. No body, no proof, just two adults chasing ghosts. But we weren't chasing anything. She had led us there, piece by piece, clue by clue. We weren't guessing, we were listening, and she was speaking. That handprint changed everything for me. It wasn't just proof, it was contact. A bridge across 25 years of silence. A message not carved in stone, but pressed in ice, fleeting and fragile, yet impossibly loud. Elise was still out there, or had been. And whatever had happened that night in 2000 hadn't ended. Not for her, not for us. The lake had secrets, and we had only just begun to break through the surface. The weeks after that handprint discovery were a blur of interviews, searches, and quiet moments of fear. We brought in experts, ice divers, forensic archaeologists, and cold case detectives, each of them carrying their own heavy disbelief at what we were chasing. The local sheriff's office, reluctant at first, expanded the search perimeter, mapping the lake floor with sonar and submersible cameras. What they found was baffling and chilling. Remnants of an old wooden structure buried beneath layers of sediment, something built long before the cabin had even existed. It looked like a small dock or a platform, but parts of it were charred, as if fire had come for it once too. The divers reported seeing what looked like tangled roots or even cables, and there was a strong scent of burnt wood and something metallic in the water. We pored over maps and town records and discovered that decades ago, before the lake had been dammed to create a reservoir, there had been a smaller, natural pond with a popular fishing spot near where the dock lay. The area had been altered, flooded, and renamed, burying its history. And, it seemed, some terrible secret with it. Meanwhile, the drone footage continued to haunt me. Replaying the flickering images, I thought I could make out shadowy shapes moving beneath the ice, like something watching, waiting. Elise's story was unfolding in fragments and silences, in things left unsaid and places no one wanted to explore. At night, I found myself dreaming of that frozen lake, the ice cracking softly beneath my feet, and a small voice calling out through the cold. Drew kept telling me to rest, to step back, but how could I? This wasn't just a missing girl anymore. It was a town's buried shame, a story that refused to stay beneath the snow. I started talking to the locals, to those who had lived near Silver Pine all their lives. Some remembered the old pond. Some spoke of strange noises or lights on the lake in winter, rumors dismissed as superstition. One elderly woman handed me a faded photo of a little girl standing near the water's edge, a face almost too young to see clearly. She whispered. She was always near the water, that one. My resolve hardened. This wasn't just a case to close, it was a life to understand, a voice to honor. Elise was no longer just a name or a lost child. She was the heartbeat beneath the ice, and I would follow that sound until it led me home. The next step came unexpectedly when Drew and I began digging through a pile of old municipal permits buried in the dusty county archives. Among the stacks of yellowed papers and faded blueprints, we uncovered a detailed drawing for an underground utility vault sealed beneath Silver Pine Lake, decades before the cabin was built. The vault was intended to house electrical equipment to control the dam nearby, but the documents showed it was abruptly decommissioned after a fire, details vague, investigations inconclusive. The location on the map aligned perfectly with the drone's thermal anomaly. This connection suddenly turned the puzzle on its head. We called in a team of engineers and divers experienced in cold water operations, and they descended into the lake's frigid depths, the water so icy it seemed to burn as it seeped through wetsuits. Beneath layers of ice and silt, the divers found corroded wires, shattered metal panels, and scattered remnants of personal belongings. A single child's mitten, worn and faded, a broken toy car half buried in mud, and a piece of cloth that matched the colors Elise wore that last winter. No human remains, no clear answers, but these fragments spoke in whispers, telling a story of confinement and fear that had long been silenced. Even more chilling was the discovery of a shallow indentation in the mud near the vault's sealed entrance, like desperate hands had clawed at the earth in a final effort to escape. The image of that indentation stayed with me, paired with the drone footage showing fleeting shapes moving under the ice. It seemed to confirm that the vault was more than an abandoned utility room. It was a prison of frozen time, holding secrets no one dared face. We compiled every detail into a comprehensive report that reverberated through the county offices and into the public eye. The sleepy town of Silver Pine was suddenly thrust into the spotlight, a stage for a story that was equal parts tragedy and mystery. But with the attention came resistance. Voices from the community, some steeped in old loyalties and fears, urged us to stop, to let the past rest quietly beneath the ice. But each warning only strengthened my determination. Elise was no longer just a name whispered on the wind. She had become a symbol, a light cutting through the darkness of decades, demanding to be heard. I knew this path would be long and treacherous, but I was ready to follow wherever it led, through frozen waters, buried lies, and the silence that had waited far too long to be broken. I remember the moment the divers emerged from beneath the ice, carrying a figure wrapped tightly in a thermal blanket. It was surreal, like something pulled from a nightmare or an old legend whispered on cold nights. The woman they brought up was in her early 30s, pale and shivering, but alive. The forensic team wasted no time: DNA tests, fingerprint scans, and each result matched Elise Granger, the little girl who had vanished 25 years ago on a winter's day near Silver Pine Lake. Yet, despite all the evidence that connected her to that long-lost child, she was a stranger to us now. When she first opened her eyes, there was confusion, a blankness that weighed heavier than any words. She didn't speak, just blinked against the harsh sunlight and the crowd pressing in, the voices echoing like ghosts. It was days before she whispered anything at all, and when she finally did, her voice was barely more than a breath, fragile and hesitant. "Where is the lake?" Those two words shattered the silence and reopened wounds that time had only barely begun to heal. She seemed lost to a world that had marched forward without her, unaware of the decades that had passed, unaware of the cold that had held her in suspended animation. The doctors said she was disoriented, suffering from severe trauma and memory loss. But to me, it felt like she had crossed a border between two lives, the one before her disappearance and whatever lay beyond. Her return wasn't the miracle anyone had hoped for. It was a mystery wrapped in grief and questions no one was prepared to answer. Where had she been all those years? How had she survived in the lake's icy grip? And why did she ask about the lake, as if it was something she'd lost or feared she would lose again? Her silence spoke volumes, carrying secrets frozen beneath the surface. Whispers caught between breaths, stories written in the shadows of a childhood stolen and reclaimed. Every day since, she has been slowly piecing together fragments of a life, interrupted, relearning faces and places, but always circling back to that frozen water, the place where everything changed. I watch her, caught between hope and heartbreak, knowing that her return is just the beginning of a journey none of us can yet understand. The lake holds its secrets tightly, but she is the key, and maybe, just maybe, her story will finally bring the peace we have all been searching for. The theory they whispered about in hushed tones during the countless interviews and medical briefings sounded like something out of a science fiction novel, but it was the only explanation that could make sense of the impossible. Experts speculated that Elise had somehow been trapped in a state of suspended animation, preserved beneath a unique frozen layer in the depths of Silver Pine Lake. This layer, a rare and almost mythic phenomenon, could have created a natural cryogenic prison, holding her in a fragile stasis where time seemed to stand still. It was a theory that both fascinated and horrified those who studied it, a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit with the way we understood life and death. Others whispered darker possibilities, that she had been taken, hidden away in some secret place, only to be returned decades later, or that she had never truly been gone at all, just slipping between worlds, a ghost caught between the living and the lost. Her body, when finally recovered, showed no signs of aging. It was as though the years had peeled away from her skin like old paint, leaving the child who vanished so long ago frozen in time, untouched by the passage of seasons or sorrow. But then, the moment she surfaced, the reality crashed in subtle lines, faint shifts in muscle and bone, the quiet markers of a life caught between moments. That contrast unsettled the experts most of all, a living contradiction that challenged every rule and assumption. Her return wasn't a simple reunion with the past, It was an upheaval of what we thought was possible. Theories collided with grief and hope, blending into a complicated narrative that no one wanted to admit was real. It was as if the lake itself held a secret too powerful for us to grasp, a secret that had protected her and imprisoned her in equal measure. I watched from the sidelines, feeling the weight of a mystery that didn't seem to want to unravel easily. The silence around her past deepened, the questions multiplying faster than the answers. What kind of force could hold a child beneath ice for decades? Was it nature, science, something else? And what did it mean for the family who had waited all these years, and for the world now faced with a story that defied reason? Elise was both a miracle and a riddle, a bridge between what was lost and what might still be found. As the experts debated and the world watched, I thought about the lake, how it held its breath, how it kept its secrets, and how it had given us back a child who was never supposed to return. But maybe that was the point. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They are meant to be lived, with all their darkness, light, and haunting beauty. 2 months had passed since Elise was pulled from the frozen lake, and the town was still caught between disbelief and the fragile hope her return had sparked. The air had grown colder, the ice thicker, and the scientific teams had decided to send the drone out one last time before winter sealed the lake completely. I stood at the edge of the shore, watching the monitor flicker as the drone slipped beneath the forming ice, its camera slicing through the cold darkness like a searching eye. The image that came back chilled me to my core. There, at the bottom, illuminated by the drone's pale light, were 7 figures standing in a perfect circle. Their outlines were sharp and distinct, not drifting or blurred by the murky water, but rooted to the lake bed as if waiting for something or someone. The shapes didn't move, but their stillness was eerie, like a frozen moment in a forgotten story. I stared, searching for any sign of life, any hint that one of those figures might be Elise. But she was not there. It was as if the lake had given her back to us alone, leaving the others behind in that silent underwater gathering. The scene was haunting. It felt like a secret ritual frozen in time, a reminder of the invisible lives intertwined beneath the surface, the stories swallowed by water and ice that no rescue could rewrite. The drone circled the formation slowly, its sensors humming softly in the cold air. The images transmitted back to the control center were immediately shared with experts, journalists, and families who had long waited for any closure, any clue. Some called it a miracle. Others whispered of unfinished business, a mystery deep and dark enough to challenge reason. To me, it felt like a final echo from the past, a message etched beneath the ice that our search for answers was never truly over. Standing there on the frozen shore, I thought of the lake as a keeper of secrets, its depths both a prison and a sanctuary. Elise's return had shifted everything we thought we knew about loss and time. But the 7 figures reminded me of how many stories remain untold, how many souls linger in places we dare not fully explore. The silence of that circle beneath the ice was a silence that spoke, calling out across the years, through water and cold, asking us to remember those still waiting. And though Elise was with us again, the lake held on to its mysteries, its shadows, and the haunting shapes of those who never left. I felt a strange comfort in that, the sense that some endings are just beginnings disguised in frozen stillness, and that the truth might always lie just beneath the surface, waiting for us to see it. Really see it.